We're asking our presenters to do the impossible, and that is to talk to you for 2 minutes each about these tools and incentives.
Hi, everyone. So I think I'm the T in TOD this afternoon. I haven't actually gotten to talk about the Transit Master Plan in a long time because it's been adopted for 2+ years now, but Transit Forward Rhode Island 2040 was developed between 2018 and 2020, adopted in December of 2020 by the State Planning Council, so that it is now a component of the state guide plan and of our state's long-range transportation plan, what gives it some legal standing and means it really cannot just sit on a shelf, which it will not do. It's already being implemented, which is good news. Here's what the plan says for Rhode Island. Frequent service, that means 10-minute service, 15-minute service, in some places even 5-minute service for transit routes throughout the state, especially in the urban areas. Crosstown service, Cranston, that one's for you. You know what I'm talking about. Rural service, which may not look the same as urban service. It might not be a 40-foot bus, but a presence and mobility supports in every town in Rhode Island. Accessible service, and this means better bus stops, more sidewalks, safer intersections, and complete streets. And really specific to today's conversation, transit-oriented development, and the way that the Transit Master Plan will be supporting that is through a network of mobility hubs throughout the state, including very large regional hubs, as well as small, really as small as a village mobility hub, which might even look like a very nice park and ride lot in a small town in Rhode Island. They're scalable. All of them can support transportation, and many of them will be able to support development as well. And then finally, high-capacity transit, which definitely will include some bus rapid transit in dedicated bus lanes, and may even include light rail. That's going to be a community decision that's going to be made over the next 12 to 18 months. That planning process is funded and will kick off within the next 3 to 6 months. So something to look forward to there. We anticipate, although we are open to however it unfolds, that transit development, oriented development, really can be targeted to those larger mobility hubs, to the high capacity transit corridors, and even to, and this is really the last thing I'm just going to kind of finish on, our rapid bus network, which is 15-minute service on 7 lines serving the Metro Providence area, which is going to, if you're familiar with the R line, it's the R line times a lot. And throughout those corridors, there's just incredible capacity to do great things. So we really, really look forward to being a part of this process. Thanks.
If you're not yet familiar with the Transit Master Plan, go to transitforwardri.com. There's really something in it for every community, and the bottom line is that if implemented, not if, when implemented, we'll be getting more people where they need to go more quickly, bottom line. It's my pleasure to introduce Senator Meghan Kallman, who's going to speak about the next proposal, which is a funding proposal for the Transit Master Plan. Senator.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. So there is a bill in the General Assembly. I'm supporting this in the Senate. I'm supported in the House by Rep. Dawson, which is intended to address at least partially the funding issues that RIPTA as well as sort of Complete Streets faces generally. So Massachusetts has been doing this for some time. They impose a surcharge on rideshare. So this is Uber and Lyft in Massachusetts. It's a 20-cent surcharge. and the money goes to the originating community. So if I get on the lift in Worcester, Worcester gets the money, and they have to dedicate it to a complete streets sort of scenario. Rhode Island's proposal is a larger surcharge, and the money is split down the middle. Half of the money goes to the originating community. So if I get in the lift in Pawtucket, then Pawtucket gets half of the money, and the other half goes towards funding the transit master plan, which, as you all know, is an excellent plan, but it doesn't have the resources that it needs just yet. And as of about 30 seconds ago, I'm pleased to report that the Climate Jobs Coalition just unanimously voted to endorse that proposal. So we're hopeful that it'll gain some traction this year.
So you heard this morning about the TDI Fellows Program in Massachusetts, and Noah Koretz from MassDevelopment is going to give us the 2-minute commercial.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Noah Koretz. I am the Director of Transformative Development at MassDevelopment, and you heard from Dan Rivera, our CEO, this morning. So the Transformative Development Initiative is a program at MassDevelopment. It's grown pretty substantially over the last year, really, but we started in 2015, and we're a pretty unique program. We're only for gateway cities, which are people familiar with that term in Massachusetts? Anybody? So basically, it's the cities, sort of post-industrial cities outside of the Boston core, right? So the stats are 35,000 to 250,000 in population, and then educational attainment of BA or higher, and median household income below the state average. So our program for those cities, we operate almost like, if you think about what a business accelerator does for a startup or scale-up business, we take a similar model and apply it to neighborhood revitalization. So we do a major commitment of resources to a very specific neighborhood, like maybe even sub-neighborhood level. So a piece of a downtown or a commercial node in a bigger city, 5-block walking radius for the most part. And during that sort of 3 to 4 year time period, we work on real estate development, small business development, arts and culture, placemaking, long-term strategic planning, community input. And we do this all with a partnership model. So a municipality can't even say on their own, we want you to come work with us. They already have to be working with a cross-sector partnership, including anchor institutions, neighborhood groups, small businesses in the neighborhood, things like that. So, and then we layer all this work on top of that partnership. So while we're doing projects, we're building that partnership, making them more resilient, getting them the technical assistance so that that model of working can kind of survive after we leave. And there are a number of, I think, many states call gateway cities like legacy cities, or just kind of small and medium-sized post-industrial cities. Most state models just are basically grant-based, right? It's like, here's a bunch of grant funding. We have grant funding available. We have different pockets of funding for programs and for projects available, but I think we're unique in that the money follows the people, right? Ultimately, what we're doing is investing in people in the neighborhoods, right? So it's a lot of our work in the community is who is there, who are leaders in these communities, especially leaders that haven't been adequately represented at leadership tables before, and how do we build that coalition and then fund the amazing projects and programs that are created out of that coalition. And so the sort of special sauce of our program is what we call the TDI Fellows. So speaking about sort of being people first, we hire a full-time staffer, mid-career usually, someone with significant experience, to work solely in each neighborhood that we work in. So every neighborhood that we work in has a dedicated staff member who's on the ground working in that community every day as a local organizer for community and economic development. And so as a state agency, a big state agency, we're essentially a big state bank. It's very unique in that we're actually embedded in the community, right? So we have staff in our community, in the neighborhood, at the street level, in some of the more distressed, economically distressed neighborhoods in our urban areas that are feeding projects and ideas and connections back into the state government apparatus. So what we're ultimately trying to do is funding people and projects in places that don't typically have access to government resources into this type of funding. And you heard Dan this morning talk a little bit about local developers. That a lot of that is coming out of our work, where we're saying, all right, who are the people who are building high density, naturally occurring affordable housing in our neighborhoods? Who are the people who have figured out how to flip houses, but maybe able to take on bigger and more complex projects if we gave them the same access to state government and resources that the bigger developers typically have. So that's kind of the model about how we work, and we got majorly accelerated last year in the final year of the Baker administration, and we're now working. We have active TDI districts in 13 cities around the state. All the state borders. We're in Lawrence and Fall River and all the way out to Pittsfield. So we're working in a lot of cities around Massachusetts. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I get to both tell you about a program and I get to tell you the deadline, because we are currently accepting applications, which makes me very excited. So if you're not familiar, Site Readiness is now in its 4th year with Rhode Island Commerce. It is a really flexible grant program that partners commerce with state dollars, with cities, towns, or private developers to help them do the things that they need to get done to unstick development. So this isn't commerce or the state coming in to tell a municipality what they need. This is the city or town or developer telling us what they need to get economic development going, and then we can help fund it. These are smaller grants. They're typically less than 6 figures, but we get to do really exciting things that range from helping with sewer and water infrastructure or engineering studies to traffic studies to funding the community engagement process for a city or town that is trying to update their comprehensive planning. So this is a really exciting grant program. Applications are open through March 29th, which I think Jillian Finkle is going to come up behind me and talk about Main Streets a little bit. But we also do have our Main Street grant application open, and it's running on the same timeline with a due date of March 29th. So these are really exciting, flexible tools where the state has the opportunity to come in and partner and help do the things that cities and towns want to get done.
Just a reminder that some of the things you're hearing about are things that are already in place, like we just heard with the Site Readiness program. Some are not yet enacted, or some may be on the books, but not nearly capitalized enough. So I just wanted to remind you of that, and I'm going to invite my colleague Jillian Finkle up to talk about the Main Street concept.
Hi, everybody. So I am talking about Main Street and downtown revitalization, but I do just want to clarify that when we say that, we're really talking about any kind of traditional commercial district. So it could be a village or town center or any kind of compact business corridor or street. And Rhode Island is really lucky because we have a lot of these places. And I think Kara just mentioned that we have some great programs in place in Rhode Island that support the physical improvements to these places. But Grow Smart Rhode Island also believes that we need to be investing in the people part of the equation of place. And you know, we do have these great opportunities in our main streets and downtowns to add more housing. It's where, you know, it intersects with transit, where it intersects with business, and other amenities is really the kinds of places that people do want to live, right? And we also have lots of people around the state who are already working very hard to make these places try to function really well as places. But right now, everyone is out there kind of coming at it from a different angle. So we have our neighborhood associations, we have our city, you know, employees, we have our chambers of commerce, and we don't have a centralized hub or network for all of these people who care about their place to come together and learn, grow their capacity, learn about best practices, share ideas. And so Grow Smart Rhode Island we have a plan hoping to establish a statewide network for these people. We haven't had it here in the past, though it does exist in 42 other states under a national organization called Main Street America. And it's really great results, economic benefits, and also develops the capacity at the local level to advocate for the types of developments that we are discussing today, like TOD. So we don't think this is the only piece of the big ecosystem puzzle that will solve our housing crisis, but we do think it's an important piece, and that's why I wanted to bring it up today. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to move on from the capacity enhancements and infrastructure category to zoning and land use reform. And to start us off, we're going to hear from Bryce Kelley with HousingWorks Rhode Island on an exciting new tool that's been under development, which will be of help to municipal officials, but also to investors in understanding where opportunities for development are.
All right, I'll try to keep it pretty brief. My colleague Annette Bourne dropped off a packet of information at each table. But zoning is really integral to transit-oriented development in any development at all. And HousingWorks Rhode Island has really moved into this space, specifically through mapping. And we really took a lot of inspiration from Desegregate Connecticut's Connecticut Zoning Atlas, and have since joined the National Zoning Atlas Collaborative as the Rhode Island partner, where we seek to map all the zoning throughout Rhode Island as it pertains to residential development. So we're really excited about it. We've almost completed it, and we're looking to launch that through the National Zoning Atlas later this spring. Also, we seek to create an additional interactive map that will live on our website that will integrate a lot more of Rhode Island-specific layers, such as environmental, transit, infrastructure layers that are really pertinent to Rhode Island development. So we see this tool as being really, really helpful to developers, municipalities, elected officials, and residents to really understand the full landscape of zoning throughout the state, where you can build what and what regulations are attached to those types of developments.
So if you were here this morning, you heard a lot about the 40s, the Chapter 40s in Massachusetts, 40R, 40S, 40A, and Ted Carman is going to join us to explain briefly about these and he knows because he authored most of them. But I'll let Ted explain further.
Happy to be back in front of you again. In fact, I did come up with the idea for Chapter 40R 20-some years ago because I was so frustrated with the discussion that was taking place about affordable housing, where the whole emphasis was on the subsidy side of it, when in fact, as a developer, the problem was a zoning problem, and you just couldn't get zoning. So Chapter 40R says that if a city passes a Chapter 40R district, they get a financial incentive which runs from $100,000 up to $600,000. For instance, Brockton did a Chapter 40R district in the downtown that allowed, 500 or 600, if not 1,000 units, and they got paid $600,000 cash. And then when each unit gets finished and gets a certificate of occupancy, they get $3,000 more for each unit that gets that's been built. The program is only available in smart growth locations. The definition for smart growth is fairly broad. It's not just around train stations. It's also in town centers and places that have existing commercial development. So the big problem with 40R, I mean, it's a terrific idea. The big problem is that it took until a year or two ago a 2/3 majority to pass. And so the problem was that if you had any opposition, you basically could not get it through, and number one. And number two, it's complicated to go through the steps, so it costs $20,000 or $30,000 of consulting time and so forth, and it's hard to put that kind of money up if you don't know you're going to win. So the recent legislation, the Chapter 40A and the choice legislation changed for all multifamily and zoning to 50% or 50.1%. Huge improvement. I mean, the Baker administration gets lots of credit for having accomplished that. So I think 40R may see a much greater resurgence. What has happened to a great extent is I think almost every gateway city in Massachusetts has a substantial 40R district because that's where communities have approved this. Now, the second piece of this was Chapter 40S, because you have particularly housing homeless families, housing families, period, you've got a huge school cost pushback. And 40S basically says that for housing built in a 40R district, if the cost of educating the children who live in the housing exceeds 50% of the property taxes paid by the development, the state will make up the difference forever. We actually got that passed. It was and it's turned out not to have been used very much. But we did a very interesting project in Beverly a few years ago where a CDC put a lot of time and effort into this. We got a 4 or 5 acre site zoned for 78 apartments. It was focused on 2 and 3 bedroom units, focused on homeless families. The cost of education for those kids is likely to be $1 million a year. The property taxes are $50,000 a year. So the city council passed it unanimously because Chapter 40S was there saying the state would make up the difference. And the same CDC is now doing a similar project in Salem. But you would think with this success it would be happening everywhere. It's not. It's just difficult to make them all work. And the final piece, 40A, Section 3, which I had essentially nothing to do with other than this overall concept that let's give incentives to induce more development around train stations, requires every community in the state that has an MBTA stop or a transit to zone a certain amount of the surrounding half-acre radius for multifamily housing as of right. And this is really also quite revolutionary, and communities are starting to wake up to it, but it looks like it's likely to have a significant impact over time. But I would again like just to say, the real issue is, how do you finance the projects if you're not in downtown Boston, where the rents are high? The problem is, in most of these cases, the rents aren't high enough to support the new construction if you don't put together a lot of subsidy. So when you're thinking about the problem, you really should have that at the front of your mind, because the need is for more production, because production is what keeps rents down. Thank you.
So Ted spoke about the 40A, which is the essentially TOD zoning, and there is a proposal in the General Assembly, and Senator Kallman is going to brief us on that.
You guys don't have to clap for me, I was just here. So we are trying to copy some of the best of what Massachusetts has done on this. So forgive me for reading off my phone, but I want to make sure I get this all right. So the idea is that so the same elements of the TOD proposal in Massachusetts, I think, can suit Rhode Island with a couple of modifications. And I want to give a shout out to my home city of Pawtucket, because we actually did TOD zoning around our new train station, which, by the way, is awesome. So if you haven't got off there yet, you should give it a ride. So the proposed bill is similar to Massachusetts, but a little bit more modest in scale, because we are more modest in scale. So in Rhode Island, all developable land within a quarter-mile radius of a regional mobility hub, as defined by the Transit Master Plan, would have to permit 10 units per acre by right, so that's a certain level of density. Communities that are already satisfying the standard are asked to do more. So it's to build up density around transit hubs. The idea is that we want to build where people can get to, where we sort of decrease reliance on cars. And frankly, for my city, we have a lot of people who already don't have cars. We need to make life easier and living easier for them. The State Department of Transportation, under this proposal, will support implementation efforts in a couple of ways. They need to do data collection, and they're specifically tasked with assessing vehicle miles traveled, because the program is proposed to be funded by a registration surcharge on heavy passenger vehicles. Those actually cause greater share of carbon emissions than they wear on state and local roads, et cetera. So the DOT is supposed to collect data on vehicle miles traveled, traffic incidents. We want them to be paying attention to what the traffic flows are doing here, as well as pedestrian and bicycle volumes for shared youth paths and transit-oriented spaces. And then the Department of Housing is tasked with developing and enforcing the regulations here. The program, as I said, is funded by a registration surcharge, or at least in its proposed form, on heavy passenger vehicles. These fees are based on what was done in Washington, D.C. recently, so there is some precedent for that. And more good news for RIPTA, theoretically, or the Transit Master Plan, is that 20% of the proceeds are going to the planning activities, but 80% of those proceeds are going to RIPTA to support implementation of the Transit Master Plan. There are some justice-based accommodations on the vehicle surcharge. For instance, people with mobility disabilities don't have to pay that. Electric vehicles and hybrids get deductions, that kind of thing. So we're trying to bake it all together in. I do know that the House has a similar version of this, which is in development. So again, we're hopeful that this is a year when we can move some significant zoning reform forward in the state. Thanks.
I know this is a lot to absorb in a very rapid-fire way, but it's important. So next, we're going to switch to the incentives, and Scott is going to describe two of them that exist, but that we can't take for granted, which is the State Historic Tax Credit and the Rebuild Rhode Island Tax Credit.
Thanks, John. I think a number of you are pretty familiar with these tools. Some of you have used them extensively, so I am going to really be brief. They both have track records of incenting a lot of housing, including a fair amount of affordable housing. The State Historic Tax Credit, in its 20-year existence, has incented about 1,000 units of affordable housing, which is, again, not anywhere near what we need. But I think when people think about the State Historic Tax Credit, they think of luxury apartment conversions and rehab buildings, but that's not the whole story. The HTC is administered by the State Historic Preservation Commission as well as the Rhode Island Division of Taxation. Rebuild Rhode Island is administered by Commerce RI. They both are providing significant, sometimes 20-25% credit for a developer, and they really address what Ted Carman is talking about, is reducing the cost for developers of a project sufficiently to make the project pencil out. And to take advantage of our huge stock of underutilized historic buildings, especially the HTC. Rebuild can be used for infill as well as for repurposing existing buildings. And the HTC has a $5 million per project credit cap. This gets a little wonky. That means a project would probably be, you could do a project up to about 20 million and to qualify for the $5 million credit. A lot of the projects are smaller than that. And I think I'll stop there.
So we also heard this morning the desirability of incentivizing market rate housing in some of our core cities. And Noah is going to be back to talk about the Massachusetts HDIP program, Housing Development Incentive Program.
I'm back. So I think I'm the Gateway Cities guy. I think that's my role here. So this is a program. I mentioned Gateway Cities before. This is a development incentive at the state level that's available for gateway cities. And like you heard this morning, you heard some discussion about how healthy neighborhoods should have a mix of incomes. And this is really to target neighborhoods in gateway cities that have had in the past a fair amount of subsidized affordable housing, but where market rate housing traditionally hasn't worked. And I think this gets into really the main condition that Ted was talking about, which is that, the construction markets are much more regional than the rent markets, and construction costs are extremely high, and these are neighborhoods where it's very hard to make the numbers work for housing. So this is meant to incentivize market rate housing, and it is very much a part of the, I think someone this morning mentioned the 7-layer DIP. I always attribute that to Brockton and Rob May, who's the Planning and Economic Development Director there, and Ted Carman, who's doing projects down there and working with the city too. all of these things all the Massachusetts things you've heard mentioned, like these all go on top of each other to try to make things work. And in Brockton, we have, HDIP on top of 40R, and that was also one of our original TDI districts, so they were accessing the resources I talked about before. And for some of this work, it required all of these things and more to make things actually happen. So HDIP essentially, there's kind of two parts to it. It's meant to incentivize market rate housing. The project has to be 80% market rate or more. And there's essentially two parts to it. There's a local tie, so there has to be a tax agreement with the city. I think it's you can sort of negotiate with the city. I think it's like 10 to 100% of the tax increment for the new development over 5 to 20 years. So those deals look a little bit different, city by city, deal by deal, but it has to sort of fall within that range. And then if you can certify a tie agreement with the city, that unlocks or triggers the ability to apply for a state tax credit, and that's kind of the big prize. So essentially, and I think it's up to $2 million in tax credits per project, up to 25% of qualified expenditures. This program has been, I should say, in flux for a few years. It sort of served very useful at first, and there were both deal level and kind of allocation level caps that essentially made the pipeline get very, very long, and essentially the program has been stalled for I think a few years now is fair to say, just because the backlog of applications have been way higher than the allocation. And so there was some hope in the last legislative session that was going to get resolved. It didn't, but a few weeks ago in the new legislative session there was actually a bill put forward that would raise the cap both at the deal level and at the allocation level for like a one year, like very large slug to sort of fill some of the backlog, and then a higher cap on a year by year basis going forward. One interesting thing about this is it requires some planning. You have to actually have a certified HDIP zone. So this is very much something that you need to create a plan with a targeted area and justify why you need to use this in that area. I have a copy of one of them from the city of Malden at the table if anyone wants to take a look at it. It's pretty straightforward to put together. I was actually involved in putting that one together in a different job years ago. One thing that's sort of interesting to note is that the way it's written, it's actually, and I think maybe I have Central Falls and Pawtucket in mind for cities that are sort of right on top of each other and where economic conditions sort of cross urban boundaries. You can actually, if there are multiple eligible communities across city lines, you can actually make them one contiguous HDIP zone if the other qualifications work. So, yeah, this is not a silver bullet end all be all. It's part of that layer and one of these incentives that we bake into these very complicated capital stacks to make catalytic projects happen in places where the rents really just don't justify the construction costs otherwise. So hopefully that will be resolved in this legislative session, and we'll have that open back up for new applications. We talk to people every day, or developers every day in gateway cities who are trying to use this and haven't functionally been able to for a few years now.
And by the way, gateway cities, the equivalent in Rhode Island, for those of you that are familiar with the term, would be hope communities, which are largely economically distressed communities. So we're getting near the end here. Ted mentioned a moment ago about a program called 40S, which provides a backstop to municipalities for accommodating multifamily development if it puts pressure on the school budget. We actually have that in Rhode Island. It passed in 2021. It's not fully activated yet because there's some work still to do, and Amy Rainone from Rhode Island Housing is going to explain that to us.
Hi, everyone. In 2021, the Rhode Island General Assembly did pass legislation which created a permanent funding stream for housing development as well as municipal technical assistance. and capitalize that with an initial award of $25 million, but will be funded moving forward on a additional transfer tax on high-value properties. So, but with this initial slug of money, they funded basically housing production, housing operating support, but then a portion of that, $5 million, is going to this municipal technical assistance side. There are a number of things that were actually authorized in that legislation on the technical assistance part. So part of it is, as Jonathan mentioned, the something akin to the 40S, and then also broad technical assistance. One of the things that the General Assembly and others have been hearing is that municipalities need help instituting changes that could reduce barriers to housing development in those communities. So Rhode Island Housing has been tasked with administering this program, and we're taking it in two phases. So in the interest of getting those dollars out on the street quickly and available to municipalities, we're focusing first on the broad technical assistance piece. We are currently have an RFP out for consultants to provide that technical assistance across a broad range of categories. So municipalities could come in for stuff like the assessment of the needs and where and what kind of housing they need. They could come in for assistance in drafting changes to their zoning ordinances or their permitting process, looking at the capacity of their infrastructure to support additional developments, engagement of folks in the community to build support for affordable housing development. So that's the piece we're working on right now. And as soon as that consultant pool is created, we'll be going out to RFP to the municipalities so that municipalities can apply for that assistance, and then they will be matched up with a consultant that can provide the appropriate assistance to meet the needs that they have. The second stage is the 40S part. So that's going to take a little bit more work to define how that's going to roll out and what it's going to look like, but we'll be tackling that next, and there will be, due to the permanent funding stream, I hope, ongoing resources that will be able to support that work as well as the affordable housing development.
So next up, I'm going to invite Kara back to the podium to talk about something that I think is a really powerful tool that maybe folks don't know so much about, and that's the state tax increment financing program, state TIF, which I think is set to sunset December 31st of this year, and I believe it can be used right now in almost any community, but I'm going to let Kara explain.
Yes, thank you so much to Scott and all of our supporters that came out to testify. All of Commerce's programs effectively sunset at the end of this year, so 15 of our programs are set for an additional 1-year extension. Sunsets are great because they give us the opportunity to make sure that we have the right tools and we're using them effectively, but as mentioned, they do all expire December 31st of this year. Just on the rebuild note, I want to just mention one thing. There's been $200 million of rebuild credits issued since 2015 in the state of Rhode Island, and that's leveraged over $3 billion worth of development. I just want to share that because the numbers are huge when you think about them, but if you also think about that, that's 54 projects in communities across the state. That's everything from housing to hotels to commercial and industrial. So these are really great tools. On the actual reason I was invited up here today, though, the tax increment financing. So tax increment financing is a tax credit rebate in the state of Rhode Island that allows you to use the incremental taxes generated by new development to pay for part of a development. So in Rhode Island, we allow you to ask for up to 30% of a project's cost. There's a little bit of wiggle room if it's for infrastructure only. And we use the new taxes that are going to get generated by that development as a rebate for the developer. So this tool has not been used as much as the rebuild tool over the last 7 years. It's actually only been used 8 times in the state, but it is a great tool, and it's one that we both have on our books today and we want to keep on our books.
And last, but certainly not least, we're going to hear about a program that we're especially proud of at Grossmart. We helped to get it enacted with the Builders Association. It's called the Municipal Infrastructure Grant Program, and it was modeled after, almost to a T, the program in Massachusetts, which has been tremendously successful, called MassWorks. And it provides grant assistance to municipalities that unlock both housing and economic development in smart growth locations. And so I'm going to invite Bill Fazioli up to describe it. Bill is the new managing director of the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank that executes the program. Bill.
Great, thank you. Yeah, as John said, it's run by the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank, and many people probably equate that to financing wastewater and water projects throughout the state, and that's been the mission from the agency since the early 1990s. But over the years, we've expanded our offerings now to provide more direct grant-funded projects. So as John mentioned, this grant is available to cities and towns and other public entities to provide financing for all those sticking points, all those things that it's a great idea, but who's going to pay for it? Things like utilities, sidewalks, stormwater, drainage, things that you don't normally see, but they're underground, but they're critically important for housing projects to happen, especially in urban infill districts. So we have a program that's been up and running since 2022. First year we awarded $1 million. 2023 we awarded $2.5 million. In 2024, we requested $5.5 million from the General Assembly to help continue this project. And the projects we fund include cities like Pawtucket, Central Falls, Lincoln, East Greenwich, Barville, and even New Shoreham. And it's really a critical tool. A lot of times projects, never proceed because they can't overcome a utility issue that has to be financed. So the developer doesn't want to pay for it, the city doesn't want to pay for it. So we're happy to, play that role and find a way to make these things happen. So I will be sitting over here if you have any additional information. And then in a former life, I did work on 2 municipal TIFs, real estate TIFs, which have been proven to be very successful in East Providence. And if anybody's interested in that, it's a very powerful tool as well. Thank you.